The bitter cold stung Eleanor Ashford's cheeks as she urged her horses forward through the mountain pass, her knuckles white against the reins and her heart pounding with determination. The Rocky Mountains loomed around her like sleeping giants, their peaks disappearing into swirling gray clouds that promised more snow before nightfall. It was February 1872, and Eleanor was racing against both winter and time to reach Downieville, California, where a new life and the promise of independence awaited her. Just a few more miles, she whispered to herself, adjusting the wool scarf that covered her nose and mouth. The two draft horses pulling her wagon struggled through the deepening snow, their breath creating plumes of vapor in the frigid air. The wagon creaked under the weight of all her worldly possessions, furniture, books, clothes, and mementos from her life back east in Boston. Eleanor had left everything familiar behind after her father's passing 6 months ago. At 26, she had refused to marry her father's business partner as expected. Instead, she had sold the family's textile business and purchased a small storefront in Downieville, where she planned to open a dress shop. The booming gold mining town needed someone with her skills, and she needed a fresh start. The first rumble was so distant that Eleanor thought it might be thunder, though the notion seemed odd in the dead of winter. She glanced up at the mountainside rising steeply to her right, squinting through the light snowfall. The second rumble came louder, and this time she saw it, a wave of white rushing down the slope. "No," she breathed, panic seizing her chest. "Go," she shouted, snapping the reins desperately. The horses lurched forward, sensing her fear, but the narrow mountain path offered nowhere to flee. The wall of snow hit with the force of a locomotive. Eleanor was thrown from her seat as the wagon tilted violently. Her world became a chaos of white, her screams swallowed by the thunderous roar of the avalanche. She felt herself tumbling, clutching at nothing but cold and darkness, before something hard struck her head and consciousness slipped away. Miles away, Thomas Turner pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he guided his horse along the snow-covered trail. At 32, Thomas had spent the last decade as a drifter, working as a cattle driver, ranch hand, and occasionally as a scout for travelers crossing the mountains. The Civil War had left him with little taste for putting down roots, though he'd started to feel the longing for something more permanent lately. He'd taken a job delivering mail and supplies to the more remote homesteads around Downieville for the winter, preferring the solitude of the mountain trails to the crowded saloons of town. As he rounded a bend in the trail, he noticed fresh tracks heading up toward the high pass, wagon wheels and horse hooves partially covered by new snow. "Fool to take a wagon through there this time of year," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. Still, something nagged at him. Nobody local would attempt that pass after the heavy snows they'd had. It had to be a stranger, someone who didn't know the dangers. When the distant rumble reached his ears, Thomas's head snapped up. He knew that sound all too well. Instantly alert, he urged his horse forward, following the tracks until they disappeared beneath a massive wall of displaced snow that now blocked the trail completely. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing against the mountainsides. "Anyone there?" Silence answered him, broken only by the soft whisper of falling snow. Thomas dismounted, tethering his horse to a pine tree away from the snow pile. Years of mountain living had taught him the signs of an avalanche, and this one was fresh, the snow still settling. "Those tracks led right into it," he muttered grimly, retrieving a shovel from his saddlebag. "Someone was under there, and they wouldn't survive long." Thomas began to dig systematically, calling out every few minutes. The snow was packed dense and heavy, and sweat soon dampened his shirt despite the bitter cold. An hour passed, then two. His muscles burned with exertion, but the thought of someone slowly suffocating beneath the snow drove him on. "Hello, can anyone hear me?" he called again, pausing to listen. This time, something caught his attention, not a sound, but a slight discoloration in the snow several feet to his left. Rushing over, he found a piece of red fabric protruding from the white. He dug frantically, uncovering what appeared to be the canvas top of a wagon. "Hello? Anyone alive in there?" he shouted, clearing snow from what he now recognized as the rear of an overturned wagon. A faint sound reached his ears, a moan so quiet he almost missed it. "I hear you. Hold on," Thomas called, digging with renewed vigor. He cleared enough snow to reveal the wagon's frame, finding a small pocket where the canvas top had held against the crushing weight of the avalanche. Within that space, he saw a pale hand. Thomas carefully removed more snow until he could see a woman's face, her skin nearly as white as the snow around her, lips tinged blue. Her eyes were closed, but another soft moan escaped her lips. "I've got you," he said, continuing to dig until he could reach in and pull her free. "Can you hear me, madam?" Eleanor's eyelids fluttered weakly. "My horses," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't worry about them now," Thomas said, wrapping his coat around her as he lifted her from the wreckage. "We need to get you warm." Eleanor tried to focus on the man's face, but darkness kept threatening to pull her under again. "My things," she protested weakly. "We'll come back for what we can," he promised, carrying her to his horse. "Right now, we need to get you someplace warm before nightfall." Thomas managed to settle Eleanor in front of him on his horse, keeping one arm securely around her waist as they descended the trail. Her head lolled against his chest, consciousness coming and going. "Stay with me," he urged. "What's your name?" "Eleanor," she murmured through chattering teeth. "Eleanor Ashford. I'm Thomas Turner. You're safe now, Miss Ashford, my wagon, everything I own. We'll figure that out later," he said. "There's a line shack about a mile from here. We can shelter there until the storm passes." Eleanor wanted to protest, to insist they recover her belongings, but she couldn't find the strength. Instead, she surrendered to the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the surprising warmth of the stranger's chest against her back. The line shack was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, and some basic supplies left for travelers or cowboys caught in bad weather. Thomas carefully carried Eleanor inside and laid her on the bed. "You're lucky," he said, quickly building a fire in the hearth. "You could have been under there for days before anyone found you." "How did you find me?" Eleanor asked, her voice stronger now that she was out of the biting wind. "I saw your tracks heading into the pass. Then I heard the avalanche." The fire caught, and Thomas turned his attention to Eleanor. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes. You'll catch your death otherwise." Eleanor's eyes widened. I can manage," she said, trying to sit up but finding her limbs uncooperative. Thomas smiled slightly. "I've got sisters, madam, and I promise I'm a gentleman. But frostbite and hypothermia won't care about your modesty." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. She knew he was right. Her medical knowledge from caring for her father told her as much. Thomas helped her remove her sodden outer garments, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible while still ensuring she was properly attended to. He wrapped her in the rough wool blankets from the line shack, then busied himself making a pot of coffee over the fire. "How far were you planning to travel today?" he asked, keeping the conversation going to ensure she stayed awake. "Downieville," Eleanor replied, gratitude warming her despite her circumstances. "I purchased a storefront there. I'm going to open a dress shop." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's quite an undertaking for a woman alone." "I'm quite capable, Mr. Turner," she replied, a hint of her usual spirit returning. "And I had little choice after my father died. It was either forge my own path or marry a man I despised. He nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. Fair enough. Though I should tell you, Downieville isn't exactly the fashion capital of the West. Despite everything, Eleanor laughed softly. Perhaps not, but every woman, even in a mining town, deserves a dress that makes her feel beautiful. Thomas handed her a cup of hot coffee. Can't argue with that logic. Drink this, it'll help warm you from the inside. Eleanor accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm tin. What will happen to my wagon? My things? Thomas's expression grew serious. The avalanche was substantial. We can try to salvage what we can tomorrow, but… He hesitated. Most of it is likely buried under tons of snow and won't be recoverable until spring thaw, if at all. The reality of her situation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Everything she owned, everything she'd brought to start her new life, buried under snow and ice. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. I'm sorry, Thomas said quietly. We'll do what we can. Eleanor nodded, forcing herself to regain composure. You've already done more than I could have hoped for, Mr. Turner. You saved my life. Call me Thomas, he said, stoking the fire, and anyone would have done the same. I doubt that, Eleanor replied softly. Thank you, Thomas. As night fell, the small shack grew warmer with the fire blazing. Eleanor's strength gradually returned, though her head throbbed where she'd been struck during the avalanche. Thomas prepared a simple meal from his provisions: beans, jerky, and hardtack softened in the bean broth. It's not much, he apologized, handing her a tin plate. It's wonderful, she assured him, suddenly ravenous now that feeling had returned to her extremities. Thomas sat across from her, studying her with frank curiosity. So, what made you choose Downieville? It's not exactly the first choice for most Eastern ladies. Eleanor smiled slightly. My mother's cousin lives there, Martha Caldwell. She wrote to me after my father died, suggesting I might find opportunity in California. When I learned there was no proper dressmaker in town, it seemed providential. Martha Caldwell, Thomas repeated, recognition lighting his features. The widow who runs the boarding house on Pine Street. You know her. Everyone knows Martha, he said with a chuckle. She's been trying to marry off half the men in town to any respectable woman who passes through. Eleanor's cheeks flushed. She mentioned nothing of that in her letters. Thomas laughed outright at that. I imagine she wouldn't. Don't worry, you seem capable of fending off unwanted suitors. I've had practice, Eleanor replied dryly, thinking of her father's business partner and his persistent proposals. As the night deepened, Thomas insisted Eleanor take the narrow bed while he made a pallet on the floor before the fire. Despite her protests that he'd already done enough, he wouldn't hear of any other arrangement. Get some rest, he said firmly. Tomorrow we'll see what can be salvaged from your wagon, and then I'll take you to Downieville. Eleanor nodded, suddenly overcome with exhaustion. As she drifted toward sleep, she wondered at the strange twist of fate that had brought this quiet, capable man to her rescue. It wasn't at all how she'd imagined beginning her new life in the West, but she was alive to begin it thanks to Thomas Turner. Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Eleanor woke to find Thomas already up, tending the fire and preparing coffee. Her clothes had dried overnight, hung carefully near the hearth. How's your head? Thomas asked, noticing she was awake. Eleanor touched the tender lump at her temple. It aches, but I'll survive. Good. We should get moving if we want to check your wagon before heading to town. Eleanor dressed while Thomas stepped outside to check on his horse. When he returned, she was standing by the fire, her hair neatly braided and her expression determined. I'm ready, she said, though her stomach nodded with anxiety at what they might find. The ride back to the avalanche site took longer than expected. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering their tracks and making the trail treacherous. When they arrived, the scene was even more devastating in the clear light of day. The wall of snow was massive, extending several hundred yards across the trail and up the mountainside. Only the very edge of Eleanor's wagon was visible, the rest buried completely beneath the crushing weight. "My God," Eleanor whispered, dismounting slowly. Thomas tied his horse and approached the wreckage, examining what little was exposed. "The structure's completely crushed," he said grimly, "but we might be able to pull out some smaller items." For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side, Thomas digging while Eleanor carefully extracted whatever they could find: a trunk of clothing, some books, cooking utensils, and a few personal items. Most heartbreaking was discovering her precious sewing machine, the metal frame twisted beyond repair. "My mother's wedding ring was in a small box," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady, "in the compartment beneath the driver's seat." Thomas dug methodically until he located what remained of the seat. The small wooden box was miraculously intact, and when Eleanor opened it, she gasped with relief to find the gold band inside. "At least I have this," she said, slipping the ring onto her finger for safekeeping. By midday, they had recovered perhaps a quarter of Eleanor's possessions. The rest, including most of her furniture, fabrics, and household goods, remained buried under tons of snow and splintered wood. "We've done what we can," Thomas said finally, seeing Eleanor's exhaustion. "The rest will have to wait for spring thaw if it's recoverable at all." Eleanor nodded, fighting tears. She had known the risk of traveling west, but she hadn't anticipated losing nearly everything before even reaching her destination. Still, she straightened her shoulders and met Thomas's gaze. "I'm ready to continue to Downieville," she said firmly. Thomas helped load their salvaged items onto his horse. "It's about 4 hours' ride from here. We should make it before nightfall." They rode double again, Eleanor sitting before Thomas, acutely aware of his presence. Despite her losses, she found herself strangely at peace. She was alive, she had her mother's ring, and she still had her skills and determination. It would have to be enough. "Have you lived in Downieville long?" she asked as they descended into a valley. "About 3 years," Thomas replied. "I drift sometimes, taking work where I can find it, but I always seem to come back. Something about the place gets under your skin." "What do you do there?" "Odd jobs mostly. I guide hunting parties in summer, deliver mail to outlying areas in winter. Sometimes I help the sheriff when he's short-handed." He chuckled softly. "Jack of all trades, master of none, I suppose. I'd say rescuing women from avalanches should be added to your list of skills," Eleanor remarked with a smile in her voice. Thomas laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest against her back. "First time for everything, though I hope it's not a skill I need to use often." As the afternoon progressed, the landscape gradually changed. The snow-covered peaks gave way to lower hills dotted with pines. Finally, they rounded a bend, and Downieville came into view in the valley below, a collection of wooden buildings nestled along the confluence of 2 rivers, thin trails of smoke rising from chimneys against the winter sky. "It's smaller than I expected," Eleanor admitted. "But lively," Thomas assured her, "especially when the mines are producing well." They rode down the main street, attracting curious glances. Downieville in 1872 was still very much a mining town, with more men than women by a considerable margin. The sight of Thomas Turner riding with an unknown woman caused heads to turn. "Martha's boarding house is just up ahead," Thomas said, nodding toward a large 2-story building with a wide porch. "She'll be glad to see you, though probably shocked by your condition." As if summoned by his words, the front door of the boarding house opened, and a plump woman in her 50s hurried onto the porch, her hand shading her eyes as she peered at the approaching riders. "Eleanor," she called uncertainly. "Eleanor Ashford, is that you?" Thomas helped Eleanor dismount before Martha reached them, enveloping Eleanor in a bone-crushing hug. "My dear girl, we've been so worried. You were expected 2 days ago." Martha held Eleanor at arm's length, examining her with concern. "What happened to you? And where's your wagon?" Eleanor glanced at Thomas, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past day. "There was an accident in the pass," Thomas explained quietly. "An avalanche. Miss Ashford's wagon was buried. I found her just in time." Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "Merciful heavens! Come inside, both of you, immediately. You must be frozen to the bone and starving besides." She ushered them into the warm parlor of the boarding house, sending a young maid to prepare hot tea and something to eat. Martha fussed over Eleanor, exclaiming over her bruises and the lump on her head, while Thomas brought in the few belongings they'd managed to salvage. "Most of her things are still buried under the snow," he explained to Martha. "We recovered what we could, but—" Martha shook her head, patting Eleanor's hand. "Things can be replaced, dear. You're alive, and that's what matters. You'll stay here with me until you get on your feet. I've kept your room ready." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "I don't know how I'll manage now," she admitted. "The shop, my plans, everything depended on what was in that wagon." "You'll manage because you must," Martha said firmly. "And you'll have help. Downieville takes care of its own." Thomas, who had been standing quietly by the door, cleared his throat. "I should go," he said. "Get these things up to your room and then let you rest." Eleanor stood, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. "Mr. Turner, Thomas, I can never repay what you did for me," he smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "No repayment necessary, Miss Ashford. I'm just glad I was in the right place." Martha looked between them with keen interest. "Nonsense, Thomas Turner. You'll stay for supper at the very least. I insist." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Caldwell." After Thomas had carried Eleanor's salvaged belongings to her room on the second floor, Martha showed Eleanor to a hot bath, a luxury Eleanor hadn't expected in a mining town. The hot water soothed her bruised body, and the clean clothes Martha provided, slightly too large but wonderfully dry, made her feel human again. By the time she descended for supper, Eleanor felt revived, though the gravity of her situation remained. She had very little money. Most of her capital had been invested in the goods and supplies now buried under snow. The storefront she'd arranged to purchase would require rent soon, but with what stock? How would she begin her business now? These worries faded temporarily when she entered the dining room to find Thomas waiting, his hair damp and combed, wearing a clean shirt. He stood as she entered, and for the first time, Eleanor truly looked at her rescuer. Thomas Turner was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscled build of a man accustomed to physical labor. His face was tanned from outdoor work, with lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. His hair was dark brown with touches of gold where the sun had lightened it, and his eyes were a clear, startling blue like summer sky after rain. "You clean up well, Mr. Turner," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the forward comment. Thomas's smile widened. "As do you, Miss Ashford. You look much improved from when I pulled you from that snowbank." Martha bustled in with a steaming tureen of stew, followed by a young woman carrying bread and butter. "Sit, sit. Let's eat while it's hot." Dinner was a simple but hearty affair: venison stew, fresh bread, and preserved peaches for dessert. Martha kept the conversation flowing, filling Eleanor in on all the Downieville news and gossip. Thomas spoke little but watched Eleanor with evident interest. "Now," Martha said as they finished dessert, "we must discuss your situation, Eleanor." The storefront you arranged is still available. Mr. Peterson is quite understanding and says you can have an extra month to get settled before rent is due. That's very kind, Eleanor said, but without my supplies and fabrics. We'll figure something out, Martha assured her. Several ladies in town have been quite excited about having a proper dressmaker. I'm sure some would be willing to advance orders. Thomas, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke. What about the mercantile? Old man Grissom has bolts of fabric he can't seem to sell because no one knows what to do with them. Martha brightened. That's right. And Sarah Whittaker mentioned she has trunks of her mother's sewing notions she'd be willing to part with. See, we'll cobble together what you need to start. Eleanor felt a surge of hope. If I could just make a few sample dresses, perhaps display them in the shop window. That's the spirit, Martha said approvingly. And you know, the Founders' Day dance is coming up in 6 weeks. Every woman in town will want a new dress for that. As they continued planning, Thomas watched Eleanor with growing admiration. Despite everything she'd lost, she showed no signs of giving up. Her determination reminded him of his mother and sisters back in Missouri, women who had survived the hardships of the war through sheer force of will. When the evening concluded, Thomas rose to leave. I should get going. Got an early start tomorrow. Mail run to the outlying homesteads. Eleanor stood as well. I'll walk you out, she said, ignoring Martha's knowing smile. On the porch, the night air was crisp but not bitterly cold. Stars glittered overhead like diamonds scattered on black velvet, the moon casting silver light across the snow-covered street. Thank you again, Eleanor said quietly. Not just for saving my life, but for everything after. Thomas shifted, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true, she replied. Will I see you again? The question seemed to surprise him. I'm not much for town socializing, he admitted, but I'll be around. And I'll ask around about your wagon, see if anyone might be able to help recover more of your things once the weather turns. Eleanor nodded, knowing he was offering what he could. Good night then, Mr. Turner. Thomas, he corrected gently. Good night, Miss Ashford. Welcome to Downieville. As he walked away, Eleanor hugged herself against the cold, watching until his figure disappeared into the shadows. She barely knew this man, yet somehow she felt a connection to him unlike any she'd experienced before. It was foolish. She knew she had a business to establish and a life to rebuild. Romance was the last thing she should be considering. Still, as she turned to go back inside, Eleanor couldn't help but hope their paths would cross again soon. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity for Eleanor. True to Martha's prediction, the women of Downieville rallied around her. Sarah Whittaker indeed had her mother's sewing notions: buttons, lace, ribbons, and trimmings enough to stock a small shop. The mercantile owner, Mr. Grissom, was delighted to sell Eleanor his unused fabric at a considerable discount, happy to clear space in his storeroom. Eleanor worked tirelessly, setting up her shop during the day and sewing late into the night. She created 3 sample dresses to display in the window: 1 practical day dress in forest green wool, 1 visiting dress in blue cotton with white piping, and 1 evening gown in burgundy satin salvaged from her wagon. The display attracted immediate attention, and within a week, she had enough orders to keep her busy through spring. Thomas Turner, meanwhile, continued his winter routine of mail and supply deliveries to the outlying homesteads and ranches. He returned to Downieville every few days, and though he rode past Eleanor's shop frequently, he rarely stopped in. Sometimes, through the window, he would catch glimpses of her head bent over her work, golden brown hair escaping its pins, fingers moving deftly with needle and thread. On the rare occasions they did meet passing on the street, or when both attended Sunday services, their exchanges were pleasant but brief. Eleanor sensed a reticence in Thomas, as though he deliberately maintained distance between them. It was Martha who finally enlightened her one evening as they sat by the fire in the boarding-house parlor. "That man is sweet on you," Martha declared, setting aside her knitting. Eleanor looked up, startled. "Who?" "Thomas Turner, of course. Who else?" "He rides by your shop at least twice whenever he's in town." "He hardly speaks to me," Eleanor protested, though her heart quickened at Martha's words. Martha chuckled. "That's how you know. Thomas has never been one for words, but he asks about you, how you're settling in, if you need anything." Eleanor's cheeks warmed. "He's merely being kind. After all, he did save my life." Martha hummed skeptically. "Well, you should know he's a good man. Quiet, yes, and perhaps too solitary for his own good, but honorable to his bones. Why does he keep to himself so much?" Eleanor asked, curiosity overcoming her attempt at indifference. Martha's expression grew somber. "The war, I expect. He doesn't speak of it, but Sheriff Collins says Thomas rode with a Missouri cavalry unit, saw things no young man should see, lost his father and older brother both." Eleanor nodded slowly, thinking of the quiet pain she sometimes glimpsed in Thomas's eyes. "That explains much. He came west after the war, drifting from place to place, never staying anywhere long until Downieville." Martha picked up her knitting again. "Some wounds take longer to heal than others." Eleanor understood that all too well. She had her own wounds, less visible perhaps, but no less real. The loss of both parents, the betrayal of her father's business partner who had tried to manipulate her into marriage, and now the destruction of her carefully laid plans for independence. "The Founders' Day dance is in 2 weeks, Martha remarked casually. "You should attend." "The whole town will be there." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Are you matchmaking, Martha?" "Me? Never," Martha denied unconvincingly. "But a young woman should have some enjoyment, not just work from dawn till dusk. And you've made yourself that lovely burgundy gown, it would be a shame not to wear it." Eleanor laughed, but the idea took root. She hadn't attended a social event since before her father's death. Perhaps it was time to rejoin the world of the living fully. 2 days later, Eleanor was working late in her shop, rushing to complete a dress for Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, when the bell above the door jingled. Looking up, she was surprised to see Thomas standing awkwardly just inside the entrance. "Mr. Turner," she said, setting aside her work. "This is unexpected." "Miss Ashford," he nodded, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," she assured him, though the half-finished dress on her table suggested otherwise. "What brings you by?" Thomas cleared his throat. "I was up at the pass yesterday. The snow's starting to melt in places. I thought we might be able to recover more of your things now." Eleanor's heart leapt. "Truly. When could we go?" "I'm free tomorrow," he offered, "if that suits you." "Yes," she said eagerly. "Yes, that would be wonderful. What time shall we start?" They arranged to leave at dawn, and Thomas turned to go, then hesitated. "I heard you've been doing well. With the shop, I mean." Eleanor smiled. "Better than I could have hoped, given the circumstances. The women here have been incredibly welcoming." "Good," he nodded. "That's good." He seemed about to say more, then simply put his hat back on. "I'll see you in the morning, Miss Ashford." After he left, Eleanor sat for a long moment, her heart beating strangely fast. She told herself it was merely excitement about potentially recovering more of her possessions. But she knew that wasn't entirely true. The following morning dawned clear and bright. Eleanor dressed warmly in her most practical clothes and met Thomas at the livery stable, where he had already saddled 2 horses. "I didn't think to ask if you ride," he said as she approached. Eleanor smiled. "I grew up riding in Boston, though I imagine Western saddles are different from what I'm accustomed to." Thomas helped her mount, his hands strong and sure as he adjusted her stirrups. "You'll get used to it. It's more secure for rough country." The ride to the pass took most of the morning. As they climbed higher, Eleanor marveled at how different the landscape looked without the blinding snow of 2 months ago. Spring was touching the lower elevations, with wildflowers beginning to appear in sunny spots and the scent of pine strong in the warming air. "There it is," Thomas said as they rounded a bend. Eleanor gasped. The Avalanche site was transformed. Much of the snow had melted, revealing the shattered remains of her wagon and scattered possessions. It looked like a battlefield after the fighting had ended, debris strewn across the mountainside, half buried in muddy slush. They dismounted, and Thomas tied the horses to a sturdy pine. "We'll need to be careful," he warned. "The ground's unstable with the melt." For hours, they worked side by side, salvaging what they could from the wreckage. Eleanor's heart soared when they uncovered a trunk containing her father's books and letters, somehow protected by the wagon's frame. They also recovered more clothing, kitchen items, and most precious of all, a small portrait of her parents on their wedding day. "It's not damaged at all," she marveled, carefully wiping mud from the frame. "It's a miracle." Thomas smiled, genuinely pleased by her joy. Sometimes fate is kind. By mid-afternoon, they had recovered a surprising amount. Thomas fashioned a travois to drag behind his horse to carry the larger items, while Eleanor's saddlebags bulged with smaller treasures. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor stood looking at the remains of her wagon one last time. "I should feel sadness," she said softly, "but instead I feel free, as though the avalanche forced me to let go of my old life more completely than I would have on my own." Thomas studied her profile, struck by her resilience. Most women would be in tears. Eleanor turned to him with a small smile. "Oh, I've shed plenty of those, but tears don't rebuild a life." "No," he agreed. "Courage does that." The simple compliment warmed Eleanor more than she could express. They mounted their horses and began the journey back to Downieville, the afternoon sun casting long shadows before them. As they rode, Thomas gradually opened up, sharing stories of his travels across the West, the characters he'd met, the landscapes he'd seen. Eleanor found herself laughing at his dry humor and marveling at his observations. This was a different Thomas than the quiet, reserved man she'd glimpsed in town. "You should tell stories more often," she said during a rest break. "You have quite a gift for it." Thomas looked embarrassed. "My mother used to say the same. She claimed I got it from my grandfather, who could spin a yarn that would keep you listening all night." "Tell me about your family," Eleanor encouraged. "Martha mentioned you're from Missouri." A shadow crossed Thomas's face, but he nodded. "A small farm near Independence. My father, mother, older brother James, and 2 younger sisters, Mary and Sarah. And they're still there, my sisters are, both married with children now. My mother passed 3 years ago." He paused. "My father and James died at Wilson's Creek." "First year of the war." Eleanor's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry, Thomas, truly." He nodded acknowledgement. "We all lost someone in that war. What about your family?" Eleanor told him about growing up in Boston, her father's textile business, her mother's death from influenza when Eleanor was 16, and her father's declining health afterward. "He wanted me to marry his business partner," she concluded. "A man 30 years my senior who saw me as little more than a way to acquire the business. When father died, I sold everything and came west instead." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "That took courage, or foolishness," Eleanor replied with a wry smile. "Sometimes they're the same thing." They reached Downieville as dusk was falling, drawing curious stares as they rode down the main street with the loaded travois trailing behind Thomas's horse. Martha came bustling out of the boarding house as they approached. "Success, I see," she called, eyeing their haul with satisfaction. With Thomas's help, Eleanor brought her recovered possessions into the boarding house. Among the most valuable finds were several bolts of fine fabric that had somehow survived with minimal damage, protected by oilcloth wrapping. "This changes everything," Eleanor said, running her hands over the silks and fine wools. "I can create proper examples of my best work now." Thomas watched her excitement with a smile. "I'm glad we could recover them." Before he left, Eleanor impulsively caught his arm. "The Founders' Day dance is this Saturday. Will you be attending?" Thomas looked startled by the question. "I haven't planned to. Those gatherings aren't really." He trailed off, uncomfortable. "I understand," Eleanor said quickly, releasing his arm. "But if you change your mind, I'd be pleased to see you there." After he'd gone, Martha appeared at Eleanor's side, a knowing smile on her face. "Did I just hear you inviting Thomas Turner to the dance?" Eleanor busied herself folding a recovered shawl. "I merely mentioned it was occurring." "That's hardly an invitation," Martha chuckled. "For Thomas Turner, that's practically a proposal of marriage. That man avoids social gatherings like they're carrying the plague." "Then he likely won't come," Eleanor said, ignoring the twinge of disappointment the thought brought. "Don't be so sure," Martha replied enigmatically. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as Eleanor incorporated her recovered items into her shop and completed the last of her orders for the Founders' Day dance. The entire town buzzed with anticipation for the annual celebration, which commemorated Downieville's founding during the gold rush of 1849. By Saturday evening, Eleanor found herself standing before the mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The burgundy satin gown fit perfectly, the off-shoulder neckline and fitted bodice giving way to a full skirt enhanced by a modest bustle. She'd styled her hair in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck, with a few curled tendrils framing her face. "You look absolutely lovely," Martha declared from the doorway. "Every eligible bachelor in town will be at your feet tonight." Eleanor smiled, though her thoughts immediately went to one particular man, one who likely wouldn't even attend. "I'm not looking for a husband, Martha." "Of course not," Martha agreed too readily. "But a little attention never hurt anyone." The town hall was transformed for the occasion, decorated with early spring flowers and lanterns that cast a warm glow over the proceedings. A small band played in one corner, and tables laden with food and punch lined one wall. Nearly the entire town had turned out, dressed in their finest, eager for an evening of celebration after the long winter. Eleanor received many compliments on her gown, which several women recognized as her own creation. Within an hour, she had taken orders for 3 more evening dresses, much to her delight. She danced with several partners, the young bank clerk, the mercantile owner's son, and even Sheriff Collins, who proved surprisingly light on his feet for such a burly man. Throughout the evening, however, Eleanor found her gaze repeatedly drawn to the door, hoping for a glimpse of a tall figure with serious blue eyes. As the night progressed with no sign of Thomas, she chided herself for her disappointment. He had made no promise to attend after all. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and Eleanor had just declined another dance, needing a moment's rest, when a ripple of interest passed through the crowd near the entrance. Looking up, she saw Thomas Turner standing just inside the door, looking decidedly uncomfortable in a clean black suit that, while not new, fit his broad shoulders well. Her heart gave a peculiar leap as their eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither moved. Then Thomas made his way through the crowd toward her, nodding politely to acquaintances but never taking his eyes from Eleanor. "Miss Ashford," he said when he reached her, his voice formal. "You look That is, your dress is very fine." Eleanor smiled, warmth spreading through her at his awkward compliment. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. I'm glad you decided to come." "I nearly didn't," he admitted. "But then I thought—" He hesitated, then simply extended his hand. "Would you care to dance?" Eleanor placed her hand in his. "I would be delighted." Thomas led her onto the dance floor just as the band began a waltz. He placed his hand lightly on her waist, maintaining a respectable distance between them as they began to move to the music. "I should warn you," he said quietly. "I haven't danced since before the war. I may step on your toes." "I'll risk it," Eleanor replied with a smile. To her surprise, Thomas proved to be a capable dancer, guiding her smoothly around the floor with quiet confidence. As they danced, Eleanor became acutely aware of his hand at her waist, the clean scent of soap and pine that clung to him, and the intensity of his gaze whenever their eyes met. "You dance very well for someone out of practice," she remarked. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "My mother insisted all her children learn properly. She said a man who can dance would never lack for female company." "Wise woman," Eleanor said, enjoying the flash of humor in his eyes. "She would have liked you," he said, the words clearly surprising himself as much as her. The simple statement touched Eleanor deeply. As the music ended, they remained standing for a moment, hands still joined, until the beginning of the next dance broke the spell. Thomas escorted her from the floor, and they found themselves near the open doors leading to a small porch. By mutual, unspoken agreement, they stepped outside into the cool night air. "I needed a moment away from the crowd," Thomas explained, though Eleanor hadn't asked. "As did I," she assured him. "It's a lovely evening, isn't it?" They stood side by side at the railing, looking out at the town nestled in the valley, moonlight silvering the river that flowed along its edge. The music from inside drifted out to them, muted and dreamy. "You miss Boston?" Thomas asked suddenly. Eleanor considered the question. "I miss certain aspects, the libraries, the theaters, the familiarity of it, but not enough to return." She turned to look at him. "What about you? Do you miss Missouri?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "Especially in spring when the orchards would be blooming, but like you said, not enough to go back." A comfortable silence fell between them. Eleanor found herself studying Thomas's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that never quite disappeared, the way his eyes reflected the moonlight. "Why did you invite me tonight?" he asked, turning to meet her gaze. The directness of his question caught Eleanor off guard. I enjoy your company," she said honestly, "and I wanted to thank you for helping recover more of my belongings." Thomas shook his head slightly. "You don't need to thank me for that." "Perhaps I wanted to see you in something other than trail dust," she suggested with a teasing smile. That earned a low chuckle from him. "And are you disappointed?" "Not in the least," Eleanor replied softly. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a warming, a softening that made Eleanor's heart beat faster. For a moment, she thought he might step closer, might even kiss her. Instead, he cleared his throat and looked back toward the town. "I've taken a job," he said. "More permanent than my usual work. The stage line needs a regular driver for the Downieville to Sacramento route. I start next week." Eleanor recognized the news for what it was, a declaration of intent to stay, to put down roots. "That sounds like a good opportunity," she said carefully. Thomas nodded. "It means I'll be in town more regularly. 3 days here, 4 on the road, week after week." He glanced at her. "I thought perhaps, that is, I wondered if you might allow me to call on you properly." Joy bloomed in Eleanor's chest, but she kept her expression composed. "I would like that very much, Thomas." His smile then was like the sun breaking through clouds, rare, and all the more precious for its rarity. "Then may I see you home this evening, Miss Ashford?" "You may," she agreed, her own smile reflecting his. "And I think, since you're planning to court me, you might call me Eleanor." "Eleanor," he repeated, as though testing the feel of her name on his tongue. They returned to the dance for a little while longer, sharing one more waltz before Thomas escorted Eleanor back to the boarding house. On the porch, they paused, both reluctant for the evening to end. "Thank you for coming tonight," Eleanor said. "I know these gatherings aren't easy for you." Thomas looked down at her, his expression earnest. "Some things are worth the discomfort." With gentle hesitation, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was both proper and somehow intensely intimate. "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly. "Good night, Thomas," she replied, her skin tingling where his lips had touched. As she watched him walk away, Eleanor knew with sudden clarity that her life had changed course once again, as dramatically as it had the day of the avalanche, but this time towards something wonderful rather than tragic. Spring blossomed fully in the Sierra Nevada, bringing wildflowers to the meadows and new leaves to the aspens. In Downieville, Eleanor's dress shop flourished, her reputation for fine workmanship spreading to neighboring communities. She had moved from Martha's boarding house into the small apartment above her shop, creating a cozy home filled with the possessions they'd recovered from the Avalanche site and new items she'd gradually acquired. True to his word, Thomas began calling on Eleanor regularly when his stage route brought him to town. Their courtship progressed with the steady, unhurried pace that suited them both, walks along the river when weather permitted, Sunday dinners at Martha's table, and occasional picnics in the meadows outside town. In Thomas, Eleanor found a thoughtful companion whose quiet nature concealed a sharp mind and unexpected depths. He was well-read despite his limited formal education, having taught himself from books picked up in his travels. He knew the mountains intimately, and showed Eleanor hidden waterfalls and viewpoints that few townspeople ever visited. Thomas, in turn, discovered in Eleanor a woman of remarkable strength and adaptability. He admired how she had transformed disaster into opportunity, building a thriving business from almost nothing. Her quick wit and unfailing kindness drew him out of the protective shell he'd built around himself since the war. By early summer, their attachment was the subject of much approving gossip in Downieville. Martha took particular pride in the match, though she insisted she'd had nothing to do with it. "An avalanche did my matchmaking for me," she declared to her regular boarders one evening, causing much laughter. One warm July afternoon, Thomas arrived in Downieville after his Sacramento run to find Eleanor closing her shop early. "Perfect timing," she said, greeting him with a smile that still made his heart race. "I was hoping you'd return today." "Oh," he raised an eyebrow, noticing she had a basket packed. "Are you planning something?" Eleanor nodded. "A surprise. Can you be ready to ride in half an hour?" "We'll need to stay overnight." Thomas looked intrigued. "Should I be concerned?" "Not at all," she assured him with a mysterious smile. "Pack light, but bring something nice to wear for dinner." Precisely half an hour later, Thomas met Eleanor at the livery stable, both mounted on horses and prepared for an overnight journey. Eleanor led the way, following the river south out of town. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" Thomas asked as they rode side by side along the trail. "Patience, Mr. Turner," Eleanor replied teasingly. "You'll see when we arrive." After about 2 hours' ride, they crested a hill, and a beautiful vista opened before them, a small, pristine lake nestled in a mountain valley, surrounded by pines and dotted with wildflowers along its shore. At the lake's edge stood a well-built cabin with a wide porch overlooking the water. "Welcome to Aspen Lake," Eleanor said, watching Thomas's face for his reaction. Martha's late husband built this cabin as a fishing retreat, She's let me borrow it for the night." Thomas looked genuinely surprised. "It's beautiful, but what's the occasion? Do we need one?" Eleanor asked innocently. "I thought it might be nice to have some time away from prying eyes and wagging tongues." They stabled the horses in a small lean-to beside the cabin, then carried their belongings inside. The cabin was simply but comfortably furnished with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and a dining table. A door led to a single bedroom with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt. Thomas glanced at the bedroom, then at Eleanor, his expression questioning. "I'll take the main room," he said quickly. "The settee looks comfortable enough." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his propriety even as she wondered if the time for such formality was passing. Over the months of their courtship, their embraces had grown increasingly ardent, though Thomas always pulled away before propriety was truly compromised. They spent the afternoon exploring the lake shore and fishing for their dinner. As the sun began to set, they returned to the cabin, where Eleanor prepared the trout Thomas had caught while he built a fire against the evening chill. Eleanor had brought a bottle of wine from Sacramento, and they shared it over dinner, talking and laughing with the easy comfort of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. As darkness fell outside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and the flickering flames of the fire. "This is perfect," Thomas said, watching Eleanor across the table. "Thank you for arranging it." Eleanor smiled, a hint of nervousness visible now. "There is an occasion, actually," she admitted. "Today marks 6 months since the avalanche, since you found me." Thomas's expression softened. "Is that why you brought me here? To commemorate nearly freezing to death?" "No," Eleanor laughed. "To celebrate what came after. If not for that avalanche, we might never have met properly. Martha says sometimes fate has to shake us up to get us where we need to be." "Martha may be right," Thomas conceded. He reached across the table to take Eleanor's hand. "That day changed my life in ways I never expected." "Mine too," Eleanor said softly. They moved to sit before the fire, side by side on the hearth rug, the flames casting dancing shadows around the room. Thomas put his arm around Eleanor and she leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the simple closeness. "I've been thinking," Thomas said after a while, his deep voice rumbling in his chest beneath Eleanor's ear. "A dangerous pastime," she teased gently. He chuckled. "Perhaps." He shifted slightly to look at her. "I've been offered a partnership in the stage line. The owner wants to expand to Virginia City but needs someone to manage the Downieville operation." Eleanor sat up straighter. "Thomas, that's wonderful. Will you accept?" "I'm considering it," he said carefully. "It would mean I'd be in town most of the time, with only occasional runs to Sacramento. More stability, better pay." "It sounds perfect for you," Eleanor said, studying his expression. "But you seem hesitant." Thomas took a deep breath. Such a change should be made with all factors considered. He turned to face her fully. "Eleanor, these past months have been the happiest of my life. After the war, I never thought I'd find peace again, let alone love." Eleanor's heart quickened at the word. Thomas had never spoken it before, though his actions had shown his feelings clearly enough. "I love you," he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "And if I'm to put down permanent roots in Downieville, I want to do it with you by my side, as my wife." Joy swept through Eleanor like a warm current. "Are you proposing, Thomas Turner?" "Rather poorly, it seems," he said with a self-deprecating smile. Shifting to one knee before her, he took both her hands in his. "Eleanor Ashford, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Thomas's face lit with such happiness that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. He reached into his pocket and produced a small gold ring set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. My sister Mary kept it for me. I wrote to her about you months ago." As he slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger, she marveled at how perfectly it fit, as though it had always been meant for her hand. Thomas drew her to her feet and into his arms, kissing her with a depth of feeling that left them both breathless. "I love you," Eleanor whispered when they finally parted. "I think I have since you pulled me from that snow." Thomas smiled, touching his forehead to hers. "I knew I was in trouble the first time I saw you truly smile at that line shack, when you were still half frozen but telling me about your plans for the dress shop." Eleanor laughed softly. "We've come a long way since then." "We have," Thomas agreed, his arms tightening around her. "And we have much further to go together." That night, propriety gave way to the deeper promise of their engagement. Thomas abandoned the settee for the bedroom, and Eleanor discovered that the quiet, reserved man she'd come to love was capable of a passion that matched and complemented her own. In the firelight, they pledged themselves to each other completely, their union as natural and right as the mountains rising around their secluded valley. Morning found them tangled together beneath the quilt, reluctant to leave the warm cocoon of their newfound intimacy. But eventually, the practical concerns of the day asserted themselves, and they rose to prepare for the journey back to Downieville. As they rode home, the future stretched before them like the winding trail full of promise and possibility. They would marry in the fall, Thomas decided, after he'd had time to establish himself in his new role with the stage line. Eleanor's shop was thriving, and she had already taken on an apprentice, a young girl with nimble fingers and a good eye for design. Martha was overjoyed at their news, though not at all surprised. "I knew from the moment he carried you into my parlor, half frozen and still fussing about your wagon," she declared. "Some things are simply meant to be." The wedding took place in early October 1872, when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the air held the first crispness of approaching winter. It was a small ceremony in Downieville's church, attended by the entire town, and a few guests from further afield. Thomas's sisters and their families had made the journey from Missouri, eager to meet the woman who had finally captured their brother's heart. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk that she had designed and sewn herself, with Martha and several friends helping with the intricate beadwork on the bodice. Thomas, standing at the altar in a new black suit, looked at his bride with such undisguised adoration that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes before the ceremony even began. After the wedding, the couple took up residence in a small house on the edge of town that Thomas had purchased and renovated over the summer. It sat on a rise overlooking the river, with a view of the mountains beyond, including the distant pass where their story had begun. Eleanor continued to run her dress shop, which had become the finest establishment of its kind within 100 miles. Thomas's partnership in the stage line proved profitable, and his knowledge of the mountain trails made him invaluable in establishing new routes and schedules. As winter approached again, Eleanor found herself standing at their bedroom window one evening, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift down in the gathering dusk. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured. Eleanor leaned back against his solid warmth. "I was thinking about snow," she admitted, "how something so beautiful can be so dangerous." "And yet, without that danger, we might never have found each other," Thomas pointed out, turning her gently in his arms to face him. "True enough," Eleanor agreed, placing her hands on his chest. "I have something to tell you." Thomas raised an eyebrow, waiting, according to Dr. Bennett, "We should expect a new addition to our family come late spring," Eleanor said, watching his face closely for his reaction. For a moment, Thomas simply stared at her, processing her words. Then his face transformed with a joy so pure it took Eleanor's breath away. "A baby," he whispered, his hands moving to cradle her face. "We're going to have a child," Eleanor nodded, her own eyes filling with happy tears. "Are you pleased?" In answer, Thomas lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her around until they were both laughing. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe it," he said when he set her down. "I never dared hope for such happiness." He knelt before her, pressing a gentle kiss to her still flat stomach. "I promise I will be the best father I can be," he said solemnly, "and I will always, always protect both of you." Eleanor ran her fingers through his hair, her heart overflowing. "I know you will," she said softly, "just as you've protected me from the very beginning." As winter settled over Downieville, blanketing the town in snow and ice, the Turner household remained warm and bright with the promise of new life and enduring love. Eleanor and Thomas faced the season without fear, knowing they had already weathered the worst storm fate could send their way. In the years that followed, Eleanor would sometimes tell their children first a son named James after Thomas's fallen brother, then twin daughters, Sarah and Mary, the story of how an avalanche had brought their parents together. The tale became family lore, retold at gatherings and celebrations, a reminder that sometimes life's greatest blessings arise from its greatest challenges. Thomas and Eleanor Turner built a life together in Downieville that neither could have imagined on that fateful winter day in 1872. Their love story, born in ice and nurtured through adversity, became one of the great romances of the Sierra Nevada, a testament to courage, resilience, and the unexpected paths that lead to happiness. And on snowy evenings, even decades later, Thomas would sometimes pull Eleanor close and whisper, "Thank God for avalanches," making her laugh and remember the desperate hope she'd felt when she first heard his voice calling through the snow, searching for signs of life. He had found far more than a survivor that day. He had found his future, buried beneath the snow, waiting to be uncovered. By the turn of the century, with Downieville transformed from a rough mining town into a proper community, the Turners had become fixtures of local society. Eleanor's dress shop had expanded into a department store run by their daughters, while their son managed the now extensive stage and freight company. Thomas and Eleanor themselves, gray-haired but still vibrant, could often be seen walking hand in hand along the river, their enduring love as evident as it had been on their wedding day. And when visitors asked how they had met, the couple would exchange a special smile before beginning their tale. "Well, it was the winter of '72, and there was this avalanche.